Every culture has its own form of myth making, or what we would call mythopoetics. These stories serve a variety of different social and existential functions. They are intended to tell us a little bit about why we're here, what we should value, how we should live our lives, and how we should deal with difficult circumstances, because we're all human beings and we're all limited in that way. Stories like the Arthurian legends, or Homer's Odyssey and the Iliad, of course the Greek legends as well, all of the Greek gods, the whole pantheon there. And you've also got the Christian story, which serves as its own kind of mythopoesis. All these stories are ways that people over generations stay rooted in the cultures that they're from and learn about life, about victory, about death, about sorrow, about conquering, and about their own humanity. These myths didn't just appear out of thin air. They weren't just made up one day by some random person who decided that this is the story that it's going to be. These myths all organically evolved. They were the result of tellings and retellings of similar or the same stories over the course of many generations, even centuries in some cases. You've got things like the Sumerian flood myth that appears in different epochs and in different cultures. And so there's a kind of natural trajectory to these things, and there's an organic evolution. You've got Joseph Campbell with the Monomyth, which sort of is supposed to be a guiding post for the general structure that you can elucidate out of all of these myths that appear cross-culturally. The Star Wars franchise is a good example of something that took the concept of Joseph Campbell's Monomyth, transposed it onto a futuristic sci-fi universe, and then was able to become extraordinarily successful because everyone sort of has these basic longing and desire for this kind of regular structure for how myths go along. And I think Star Wars is a good place to start because you see in Star Wars a kind of commercialization or a capitalization of the concept of mythopoetics as such, right? Where you take Joseph Campbell's Monomyth and you turn it into a purely commercial enterprise via Star Wars, and it's extraordinarily successful because it's still resonant within the culture, although it's detached from any kind of prehistorical origins or organic evolution that other myths traditionally would have been attached to. And it's also uniquely contemporary in that it's not tied to any one particular culture. Actually, Star Wars exists as a kind of universal or worldwide culture of its own, independent of the particular geographies, ethnicities, and cultural backgrounds of the people that are fans of it. And I think this points to a broader trend in today's world where the deracination of peoples from their own histories and from their own cultures, the disconnection of them from their past, means that the places where we find the meaning that we would have gotten out of myth are becoming more and more commercialized and less attached to specific myths, particularity. It's the particularity that's going away. And today I'm going to introduce a concept called the founder mythopoetics. What founder mythopoetics presupposes is that the new myths that are being formed right now are actually all around founders. Now, historically, there have been lots of myths around founders. You've got Charlemagne, you've got Jesus famously, you've got Romulus and Remus. There are, of course, myths at the foundation of pretty much any great society, Moses, etc. However, when I'm talking about founders in this sense, I'm not talking about the founders of great religions or great cities or great societies. I'm talking particularly about founders of great companies and the myths that are forming today around them. So people like Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Jensen Huang, these founders are, for the most part, living in recent memory. And so we know that they're real, and we know roughly the story of their lives and what they accomplished. We know that they are not superhuman in terms of possessing any supernatural abilities or powers that are beyond the measures of ordinary men. And yet at the same time, you can see that there's a myth forming around each of these figures. They're kind of imbued with a mythological essence when people talk about the story of how they started their company or how they overcame different obstacles, like Steve Jobs getting ousted from Apple, or Elon Musk nearly breaking down and watching as SpaceX and Tesla almost failed simultaneously in 2008. Each one of these individuals has done extraordinary things in terms of their business accomplishments, in terms of their technological ambitions, and in terms of their wealth in particular. And yet, nothing that they've done is outside the realm of human possibility, of how we conceptualize ourselves. But there is a kind of magic that's infused around them when they talk about their accomplishments and when other people talk about what they would do. And they have become figures of emulation, just like the heroes of times past, where children, college students, even adults who are equally ambitious or view themselves as potentially wanting to reach that pinnacle of success, take these role models on as men worthy of emulation, as people that they would like to become like. And they draw inspiration from their stories. They read their biographies and autobiographies and the history of their companies, and even in some cases their SEC filings, in order to understand better the mind and the actions of someone who's accomplished such a great deal. And going back to my statement earlier about the commercialization of myth and what that looks like. Well, another unique aspect of these founders is that they're not heralded specifically for their cultural context or for their ethnic background. People don't claim, oh, Elon Musk is great because he's a white South African, for example, or Mark Zuckerberg is great because he's a Jewish American. Now, it is true that the people I have mentioned all happen to be American citizens. However, that is not the reason why they're revealed. They're revered globally, not just here in the United States, but worldwide, as a result of their technological prowess, technological and business accomplishments. And so, in that sense, they are also universalizing capitalist myth, much like the Star Wars legacy. However, the stories that we can tell about them have not yet been fully formed. They're still very new, very raw, and in some cases still forming for those that are still here with us. And yet, just like all other myths in the past, the way that they will be remembered and the way in which they will be mythologized is going to end up looking very similar to the structure of the monomyth. There's going to be the beginning with the lowly hero who's coming out into a dark world. There's going to be a fall. There's going to be a slow rise. There's going to be setbacks. There's going to be moments of doubt. And then there's going to be some sort of final accomplishment, and maybe even their deaths. All of these will eventually get incorporated into a kind of myth about who they are and about what they've done. And you're seeing this already with someone like Steve Jobs, where he is memorialized and revered and criticized, and all of this is sort of forming around him posthumously in order to create the myth of the person that is no longer with us. And each of these people will end up having a similar kind of mythopoesis forming around them as they continue. And it's worth reflecting on what that means for us as people, as a culture, that these myths that are forming around these founders are independent of traditional ethnic, religious, geographical ties, that they're tied into this notion of technology and business as kind of the last frontiers of great human endeavor and great human accomplishment. And it's also worth reflecting on what that says about us as a culture and where we think we're going, that so many people choose these people in particular to emulate over all others. Now you might say there's people that want to emulate great artists or great athletes or great statesmen, but I think we'd all agree that these archetypes are much less frequent today in terms of people's possibilities and hopes for the future than they were in previous times. I'm introducing founder mythopoesis, not because it's particularly novel or because I seek to criticize this point of view especially, but because I think it serves as an interesting mirror for us to hold up against ourselves, to evaluate what it is that we value, what it is that we are trying to emulate, and to try to understand where we're going civilizationally. If these are the myths that we're choosing to create and to co-create, then that tells us something a little bit about our present and maybe even something about our past.